Danzel van Zyl is applying for bail at 3 o'clock this afternoon. We want you to be present. Do you want to be present? If you can't be present, we provide transport for you to be present. And so not as to let it impact negatively on poor people, we must be able to say also, for instance, that, hey, you're going to lose 30 rand for half that day. Maybe we can have a fund and say that we can provide the 30 rand for you, and so forth. But this kind of thing, for instance, at the sentencing stage of a proceeding, once again, we say that the victim may ask the court, the prosecutor, if he or she can speak to the court, address the court with regards to what impact the crime had on his or her current life. The discussion is it is so huge. I think that we really must move away from this. It makes a lot of these things mandatory for certain types of offenses. That what use is it if, for instance, we do in certain instances have like victim impact surveys, like in the States sometimes, in some states, in the United States, that the prosecutor is obligated to lay before the court, like, this is a victim impact study. This is the effect that crime had on this victim. And then the court has a much balance or has so much more information than that. But also the right of the community. That crime not only affects the victims and their direct family members or dependents, it also affects the community. To what extent should the community also have a safe instance when it comes to sentencing? Talking about parole, once again, the victim may have a say in parole hearing. These things need to become mandatory. That when a violent criminal is being released, I think that the victim should sit in that parole hearing to determine whether or not that person, because he's in a better position. It's not just like whether society is feeling threatened by this, because those are one of the in parole. Does this person still poses a threat to the society? But it needs to be individualized to a certain extent as well. But there has to be a balance, but I think the sentiment and feelings of the victims cannot be ignored when it comes to these things. Now, these things is set out in the victim charter and the implementation plan. But we really need to interrogate these things closer as to how we as victims can really not be subsidiary to the criminal justice system, but be central to it. And centralizing the role of victims then will provide us with a basis to move further. Because victimhood and victimization as really scary kind of effects, not only on the immediate victims, but also, like I said, on the extended families and on the community as a whole. Now, I'm glad that we have the definition of victim does include things like the immediate family. But I still think that there may be a need to get maybe a broader definition of what constitutes a victim. The effects of society can be used. I mean, if you look at, especially in our poorer communities in the rural areas, if a breadwinner is killed, the ripple effect that has throughout that particular family or immediate community can sometimes be very, very huge. And if you combine that with the HIV epidemic, which results so as the effect of many, many more orphans being destitute in South Africa, or the people who are sitting in the poor communities with lots of orphans, then we can see immediately that we need to broaden this concept of victims. Now, we have this, in 1985, South Africa, they passed has like the basic principles of justice for victims of crime and abuse of power, which set out certain basic principles. Now, these are just principles. I mean, like, if you become a signatory, you are not necessarily obliged to follow it. It's not like a treaty where once ratified, you become obliged to do it. But even then, even if you ratify the treaty, it means nothing. Because we always say that unless you domesticate those principles, there's a basic find application in terms of law, general application. It doesn't mean anything. But even having said that, we can pass legislation and then still it's difficult for us to implement these kind of things. So I mean, like, I don't even want to bother you with these kind of international law precept as to what our obligations are under international law. Suffice to say that we are a signatory, and in terms of our constitutional regard can be had to international law, and to some level we can rely on these principles in trying to make government and to enforce our rights as victims in South Africa. So a lot of proposals think like how concretely do we deal with victims of crime. And most of the discussion around that surrounds around compensation. The compensation from the starting point, I mean, people would say like, oh, the country has so many challenges. How are we going to compensate victims of crime? Who's going to get what? How are we going to value? Yeah, all this kind of thing. And usually the excuses come in before we get to like what we want to propose as to a compensation fund or things like that. But we have to start to seriously look at genuine and material ways of how we can assist victims of crime. And that's why, I mean, like, if you look at proposals for the Freedom Front Cross, for instance, that put on the table is to people being compensated. There's Andre's talking about using to, and it's a record, there's other proposals for maybe a service assurance charter for victims of crime. And I mean, we have to look at things like that, because its effects are real. So whether it's in terms of tax breaks or otherwise, we really have to discuss these things. And the debate should really be open, so that we can say like, this is but one way of addressing the rights of victims of crime. But to me, compensation, it will always center around, material compensation. And what mostly people want, and it became so clear, like even here in South Africa, we have the TRC, what people really want, sometimes closures, sometimes feels more in a psychosocial line. So if you don't have the appropriate psychosocial interventions for victims of crime, like mandatory interventions to deal with victims of, they can come to terms with what has happened to them, that probably would constitute like a big compensation. It shows that we are caring government, that government care about you as a human being. And I don't think government is going to, in terms of restitution, like give everybody a television back and say like, okay, there it is, and whatever. But on the social sector, psychological side, psychosocial side, I think that we can develop capacity to address victims in that regard. But we need to be concrete, and I really, really think that a symposium like this, where we really need to flesh out these kind of things. As to, in terms of the minimum standards, we say that people are entitled to compensation, but it's very elusive. And government, by design, are not going to provide details, and that has been told to me in so many words. It's not in our interest to give details. That we should really move probably to a point where we can say, okay,